Today, I'm back with another series review, which is Melanie Dickerson's medieval fairy tale trilogy. This is a little bit more of an anthology series. Each book focuses on a different couple. However, they all intertwine with one another. So I'm gonna give you my main thoughts on the whole series itself, and then I'll go into each book individually, talking about specific things that I liked and didn't like. So, with all that out of the way, let's get into it. So when it comes to the fairy tale aspect of each of these stories, it's a little bit more loose. I would say the vibe of this trilogy, it's very ever after a Cinderella story, the movie starring Drew Barrymore as a Cinderella character, where you're not gonna see any name recreations, and it's a more grounded setting. There's no magic, there are no fairy godmothers, dragons, etc. And so if you go in expecting a more straightforward fairy tale full of magic and whatnot, you will be let down a little bit. However, I really love Ever After, and a lot of other movies and books I love are sometimes a little bit more on the light magic system, so this didn't bother me. And because I love Ever After, and I think the vibes of this trilogy is very similar to Ever After, I really love that, and that was a highlight for me. I think also the romance in all of these were really well done. I enjoyed all the main characters, some to varying degrees, but I'll get more into that when I break down each of these books. And I think the medieval setting, really great. I'm a huge Sleeping Beauty fan, and it takes place around the same time. So I think the vibes and settings of this trilogy, immaculate and wonderful. I feel like the fairy tale inspirations were done really well. It's enough where it feels familiar, and you can kind of see the main inspirations where it's like, you can tell Huntress of Thornbeck Forest is a little bit Robin Hood-esque, Beautiful Pretender, a little Beauty and the Beast-esque, and then Noble Servant, a little Goose Girl-esque. But because the setting is a little bit different, being more grounded in reality rather than a straight-up fantasy, it's done in a really creative way where it feels familiar but also fresh, which is what I look for in a really good fairy tale retelling. I also think that throughout this, a lot of the friendships are really well done. I mean, the romance is almost always the main focus when it comes to the relationships in these stories, but I really enjoyed reading all of the friendships throughout it, and I thought that especially the ones with the women were really well done. I would say that my main critique of the series overall is Melanie Dickerson is very repetitive with information. For example, in Huntress of Thornbeck Forest, Odette, the main character, is constantly described as beautiful. It's like, whenever, we're in her love interest mind, it's like, she's really beautiful. And all the other characters are like, oh, she's so beautiful. And then similarly with other two, throughout the series, it's like, we can't be together, it has to be like this, and it's like, it felt so repetitive where I was getting a little frustrated, just like, yeah, I don't think that these guys can be together, because they said 5 times across these 10 chapters. It's like, so if you're not a fan of overly repetitive stuff, that might take you out of it. And then I will say, because it is a little bit more anthology, not all the characters and the main plot points are going to be great. I think especially by the time I got to the Noble Servant, it did feel a little repetitive in terms of plot points, but I think if you read them across, you don't go straight forward each. If you know what I mean, it will be a little less noticeable. Now, before I get into each of these individually, talking about some of the highlights and low points from each of them, I do want to address a little bit of an elephant in the room. These are sort of Christian fiction, and the way that this is throughout each of these books, you have characters talking about God, and they pray to God a lot throughout it. I would say if you go in expecting a high fantasy or just a fantasy novel with magic, and then go in, you might be a little let down, especially because I think Christianity is a little bit more prevalent than magic, but I walked in knowing that it was a little bit more of a Christian fiction story, so I was okay with it. And I will also say that it's not in a demonizing way towards non-Christians. You don't have a character who is explicitly stated to be not a Christian, and it's like, because you turned away from the faith, or because you don't believe in Christ, you now must suffer. And similarly, you don't have a point where it's like, nothing was going wrong, but then I went to Jesus and everything was solved. No, that's not how this is. I would say the Christian elements throughout these, I would compare it to maybe the musical Les Mis, where we have songs throughout it, which are prayers. For example, Jean Valjean's big solo in Act 2, Bring Him Home, is a prayer to God to save Marius. And at the beginning of the story, the priest saves Jean Valjean after, like, he steals the silver, and he's like, no, I bought your soul for God, you're okay. And however, it's not demonizing non-Christians per se, and it's more just present throughout it. And I feel like overall I didn't mind it, and if you go in knowing that it's a bit of a Christian fiction, you'll enjoy it enough. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get into my individual thoughts for each of the books. So the first one was The Huntress of Thornbeck Forest. This was primarily a Robin Hood retelling. However, in this story, the Robin Hood character is a woman, Odette. She is a poacher of the forest, specifically killing deer so that the poor people of her town and country can eat. However, her love interest, Jorgen, he's the forester, and he's now hunting, well, not hunting, but like he is searching for this poacher, not knowing that she is the one. And something I really liked about this aspect of the Robin Hood retelling is Odette and the poacher were very clearly different. Specifically, when Odette is at home, she's like the ward of her wealthy uncle, and everyone loves her. No one suspects that she is like hunting at night, but then she ultimately goes at night to hunt, and it's sort of Scarlet Pimpernel-esque if you've ever heard of that story, but I rather enjoyed that part, and I think the romance between Odette and Jorgen was really great. You have a little bit of like the forbiddenness because Odette knows that like he can't find out I'm a poacher, or else this could ruin not just our relationship, but the power that I have, like what I'm doing to help all these children. And I also appreciate that throughout how Odette and Jorgen were in their 20s, and I believe it's the same for some of the other two books, but it's like, when I read too many novels where the main characters are teenagers going on these big grand adventures, I get a little weirded out, so it was refreshing reading a more not fantasy, but like fairy tale-esque story where the characters are young adults rather than like teenagers. I think my main critique of this story was I feel like there needed to be a more clear injustice system. I mean, Odette is well off enough at the beginning, so it's like, why are you poaching? And I feel like there needs to be a very clear sense of injustice, like a cruel king, or something like in Robin Hood where the king is away and then his tyrannical brother, his tyrannical replacement, is being cruel. So I think that was my main critique, but the tone was really nice. I enjoyed getting to have moments where it's just Odette and then just Jorgen. That was another thing I really liked in this series. You have both the male and the female characters are point of view perspectives throughout, which I feel like I don't read as much nowadays, so I really liked having that, especially because you get to see what she's thinking, but you also get to see what he's thinking. So the second book in this series is The Beautiful Pretender. This one's more of a Beauty and the Beast retelling, although I found it to be quite similar to something like Cinderella, specifically Ever After, where you have this servant girl, Evelina. She works for an earl's daughter, Dorothea, and the Margrave of he is looking for a wife, and he requests all these women come to his castle. And however, Dorothea runs away shortly before the request can be made, and Dorothea's father requests Evelina to go in his daughter's stead, and says that if she can convince everybody that she is the earl's daughter, no, she doesn't get caught, he will reward her with a decent dowry and make sure that her family can eat. So it was also a little bit like The Selection, where it's like all these women are coming to a castle and this guy's like trying to find a bride. And initially I didn't love this book. Specifically, I found the first half to be a little bit contained, probably because it, we're primarily in the castle and there's not as much action. And I didn't love Reinhardt, the Margrave, as much as Jürgen. He's a little bit on the gruffer side, which is generally not what I go for in terms of love interests. But I think once Evelina and Reinhardt spend more time with each other, he doesn't suspect that she's actually a servant when they meet. But, she challenges him a little bit, which is initially not what he's looking for, but they slowly fall more and more in love. And I think once the love story started rolling a little bit more and we reached like the halfway point, I enjoyed the story a lot more. And I think that this one probably had the most compelling romance. Then the final book in the series is The Noble Servant. This is a retelling of The Goose Girl, which is a lesser known story, but in this story, the main character is Magdalene. She is the daughter of, I can't remember, but she's the daughter of a wealthy man, and she's initially going off to marry a duke. However, on the way there, her servant betrays her and specifically says, "We're gonna switch places, don't tell anyone," especially because her servant's father is also there. So when they arrive at the Duke's castle, she has to just pretend she's a servant, and her handmaid Agnes is now Magdalene, and she has to find a way to set things right. So this is probably my least favorite one. I didn't dislike it by any means. I feel like the main characters I didn't enjoy as much, and there is a little bit of a miscommunication plot line between the two at the start. But I think the highlight of this is there was weirdly an aspect of a comedy of manners almost, specifically the plot. Also, it's a little Shakespeare-esque where it's like this character was forced to get their identity swapped with this other character. However, this is also happening with this character. So the imposters fall in love with one another, and the real people also fall in love with one another, which I found really fun. And I also think this is the only one where we have a little bit of a point of view where it's not either of the main characters. We get to see a little bit of Lord Haven, who's the main character, the Duke's evil uncle, and his son is pretending to be the Duke now. And it's like, I'm suspicious of this girl. Father, I think you're just feeling guilty right now. It's probably just your guilty conscience speaking up. I don't feel guilty about this. So even if this wasn't my favorite of the series, I did really like how there was a little bit something different with it, especially because it's adapting the least well-known fairy tale of all the fairy tales being adapted in this series. So those were my thoughts on Melanie Dickerson's medieval fairy tale trilogy. I overall really enjoy them, especially with the ambiance of the medieval setting and the romance. And I would definitely recommend it to anybody who really likes stuff like Ever After, where it's a new retelling of a fairy tale where it feels familiar because it's a fairy tale, but it's also a little bit different. It's not set in a magical world, but it captures the vibes of the original story. If you enjoy this, please share this with your friends. I'm Louisa Hammond, and I'll see you next time.